It was June and the weather was crappy, as had been the case for the whole month so far. Gray skies and pouring down rain. Not a good day for driving, and definitely not a good day to be traveling across the country in a rented motorhome with a dying man in the back. Still, Don's sister Danny was intent on taking him back to her home in Ohio, despite his declining condition. I had only cared for Don for 3 days, and it was my responsibility on this Sunday to see him off. When I first heard of this madness, I was incredulous beyond belief. They're taking him where? In what? It was a request I had not ever heard in my more than 5 years working in hospice. I was doubtful we could make this happen, and even if we could, I was fearful of what could lie ahead for this family. Don was unable to stand or walk. The caved-in right side of his head was testimony to the brain surgery that left him with no use of the left side of his body and little use of the right. His main complaint was pain, and he had lots of it. Methadone around the clock helped to ease his suffering, but the development of a blood clot in his right leg escalated his agony on the morning of his departure and demanded multiple doses of morphine to control the searing pain. Don was obviously a popular guy with his former UPS co-workers and friends. There were constant visitors bringing goodies, massages, and kindness. The atmosphere in his room was often party-like, with beer free-flowing for all. Even though it was a healthcare facility, we did make exceptions for patients and visitors to toss a few back as long as they didn't cause trouble. I knew all too well the fine line between having a good time partying and getting into trouble. At times, I was forced to put aside my personal judgments and watch as Don downed his methadone with a glass of German beer. After all, I thought, what's the worst that could happen? He might die? He's already dying. My nonchalance would change in the next couple of days as Don's confusion increased, and I worried about an acceleration of symptoms that could complicate the already risky journey. It's doubtful the narcotic-alcohol combo is what led to his confusion. After all, he did have brain cancer. Nevertheless, on the morning of his departure, I suggested that perhaps water or juice would be a better choice of beverage during the voyage. I sat down with Danny and her husband and began my final instructions with them. It was my desire to impart them with every possible bit of information they might need to deal with any situation that could arise when transporting a dying patient in a motorhome for 3 days. Before I began my prepared speech, I recalled a scene I had witnessed the day before. Danny was on her cell phone discussing the details of the motorhome rental with her husband. She cupped her hand lightly over the phone. They got the biggest one. It's brand new. It still has a new smell to it, she said to Don, smiling. Don reached his hand out to Danny. High five. I saw my own brother in that instant, and I knew if it were him in that bed, I would also do whatever it took to carry out his last desire. First of all, I want you to know how much I can appreciate your decision to do this, and I support you 100%, I began. I don't want to scare you, but as a nurse, I would be remiss if I didn't prepare you for some very real possibilities that could occur during your trip. They listened intently as I began to discuss the end-of-life symptoms and how they could be managed in an emergency. Finally, I said out loud to them what I knew we were all thinking. It's a very real possibility that Dawn could die while you're traveling. The determined look on Danny's face, juxtaposed with tears that rolled down her cheeks, revealed both her resolve and her trepidation. As we hugged before leaving the little meeting room, she clung to me tightly. I wanted to tell her what I really thought. Wait, don't go today. Just give it another day and see what happens. I knew what her response to that suggestion would be, so I didn't bother making it. The motorhome was rented, the moving crew was assembled, Dawn was ready, there would be no delays. I medicated Dawn heavily with morphine and lorazepam before we began the transfer. I had already scoped out the motorhome and plotted our path. The door was narrow, the hall only slightly wider. It would be tricky and even possibly dangerous. Before we started, I leaned over Don and stroked his forehead as I spoke softly into his ear. I'm so sorry, Don, but I'm going to be honest. This will hurt and there's not much we can do to make it less painful, but we will get it over with as quickly as we can. With the aid of a mechanical lift, 2 nursing assistants, and another nurse, we were able to place Don in a reclining wheelchair. The transfer was arduous and he suffered much pain. He yelled repeatedly as we carefully rolled him back and forth, getting the lift sling into position. Once Don was seated in the sling, we hoisted him into the air and gently placed him in the wheelchair. With phase 1 completed, we were ready for the most daunting task. I wheeled Don out to the parking lot where the motorhome and half a dozen strapping off-duty UPS drivers awaited. With all that brute strength available, I would be free to direct the transfer. We formed an assembly line. 3 men passed on through the narrow opening of the motorhome to the receiving crew, who gingerly placed him on a single bed in the main living area. From there, the 2 strongest of the bunch carried Dawn down the narrow hallway and into the master bed in the back. I was able to maintain my calm during the process, but inside, I was petrified. The transfer was hard on Dawn, but he didn't complain. Once we settled him into the bed, I instructed Danny which medications to give him so he could rest in comfort. Hugs and expressions of gratitude were shared by all of us. It was an amazing process, and I felt fortunate to have been part of that special team. We heard nothing from Danny until a few weeks later when she called to let us know that Don was still alive and doing fine. He was spending his last days in the company of his sister's family and his 10-year-old son. He had made it home.